Hello. Until now, we've largely been talking about the history of war, how war has progressed, how war has shaped our world. And this last week, I want to take a little bit of a look forward. Now, I don't pretend to have a crystal ball. The capacity of social science to predict the future is extremely limited. My own personal history in being able to predict things is not very, very good. But rather than giving you a sense of what's coming, I want you to think of the following lecture as a way of thinking about the structures of what might come, about what kinds of challenges the world is facing, what war might look like in the 21st century. Now, I think there's three really big questions about the future of the Western way of war. The first one is, what is the future shape of it? That is, how is it going to work? If the kind of dynamics, the kind of processes, the kinds of organizations that we have seen roughly over the last 2 or 3 millennia, are they going to be consistent? Are they going to remain the same? The second, what does this mean? What does this change mean for the practice of the classic Western way of war? That is, for those societies that have associated themselves with this classic Western way of war that we have been largely focusing on, what do changes in war mean for those societies? What do changes in war mean for the military capacity of those societies? And then the last question is, what can be done in light of these two? That is, what can we think about as a world, as a society, when we're facing a world where war is changing and where the societies that have depended on a particular kind of war are going to be challenged in new ways? Now, I want to get at that by asking about 3 different kinds of potential conflicts around the world. The first one is major theater wars. That is, these are the classic kind of wars that we've been talking about. The second is conflicts related to the breakup of states. And the third one is terrorism. So let's talk about 3 in order. And let's first look at what the possibilities are of major theater wars. That is the classic Western way of war. Now, these are characterized by, and let's just take a laundry list of what we've been covering the past 10 weeks. It's long duration, more than one battle, extensive territory involved, mass armies, mass resources, a diffuse line, but nevertheless a line between civilian and military. These kinds of wars require large populations, rich resources, clear ideological lines or territorial lines, organized states and armies. That is a very, very important factor of organization, and some kind of territorial exchange. Now, what I want to do is take a quick sort of tour through the world and try to get a sense of where we might find these kinds of major theater wars. Where might we think that these kinds of conflicts and these kinds of wars may be relevant? Let's first look at the Western Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere. Here, certainly north of the United States, the possibility of a conflict between the United States and Canada is so far-fetched as to be largely unimaginable. The same thing could be said of a conflict between Mexico and the United States. The close alliance between the two countries, certainly the asymmetry of resources, it'd be very hard to imagine any kind of, again, major theater war, classic war. Despite some comments about the Cuban threat, one has to really stretch the imagination to think that Cuba might pose a threat to the United States. It's possible that the United States might be involved in some kind of invasion of Cuba. All things are possible, but very unlikely. And then you have the Central American states with so little military capacity as to make the kind of war that might have even occurred 40 years ago between Honduras and El Salvador extremely unlikely. So at least in the northern Western Hemisphere, we find a very peaceful in terms of these kinds of wars. We will come back to that and we'll show that all is not peaceful. How about in South America? Here again we have a hegemon that is largely Brazil. We have a situation where there are very few international tensions. There are considerable historical tensions between Brazil and Argentina, but these have been largely ironed out. There are some territorial questions between Argentina and Chile. The same, perhaps the hottest issues between Chile and Bolivia and Peru regarding their borders and the consequences of the War of the Pacific in the 19th century. But these so far have been largely resolved diplomatically. Moreover, the asymmetry of resources, Chile could certainly, the Chilean military far above the capacity of the Argentinian military, and one could argue even the Peruvian military. Brazil having a preponderance in this whole region, certainly reaching into its frontiers. One other possibility is some kind of major theater war between Colombia and Venezuela, and we have seen some squabbles across the borders, but again, neither Venezuela nor Colombia really have the military capacity, the military resources for this kind of major theater war. So largely in the Western Hemisphere, that kind of classic World War II struggle involving large numbers of men, large numbers of resources, large number of organization is extremely unlikely. Let's go to Western Europe. In Western Europe, again, despite the fraying of the European Union, clearly the alliance between France and Germany seems to be holding very well, since this has been the source of either France or Germany or France and Britain, since these kinds of conflicts have been dominant for the last 300 years. The fact that these three countries have essentially established a long-term alliance, a long-term coexistence, makes any kind of major theater war, again, in this part, very unlikely. If we move a little bit to the east, it's a little bit more likely. I remember saying about a couple of years ago that it was very unlikely that Russia would take any kind of military action at its frontiers. That just shows you how much of a clairvoyant I am. But nevertheless, notice that the Russian action in Ukraine and the Russian action in Moldova and its Russian action in Georgia have really involved a set of political intrusions, have involved the support for rebels, have involved the support for third forces, rather than, except in the limited, very limited case of Georgia, a true military kind of confrontation. Part of this is that the military structures of even Russia, but certainly the countries around it, do not really have the capacities for this kind of major theater wars. Moreover, the presence of atomic weapons in Russia makes the likelihood that any one of these bordering countries could really represent a military challenge to Russia extremely unlikely. We're now in the middle of the summer of 2014, so it's not very clear how this will develop. But again, this is not to deny the presence of a great deal of conflict in this part of the world, but to say that it is unlikely to be resolved by this kind of mass movement of troops and materiel. Let's move south and talk about Africa. Here, again, we have a question of the military capacity of the various states. That is, can any of these states really pose a danger, in a sense, to other neighbors? Even if they did, would they have the kinds of capacities for this protracted war, or would we be talking about a war of very short duration and very few resources? Obviously, there are many, many conflicts. There is the ongoing conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, but that is not being practiced, in a sense, in this classic major theater war. Rwanda has made itself something of a Prussia of the Great Lakes region, and there has been a horrific conflict going on for 20 years in the Great Lake regions, particularly in the eastern Congo, with fatalities perhaps as high as 5 million, a war that has been largely ignored by the world, by the way. But this war, despite its horrific costs, despite its horrific violence, has taken on a very different form than the kind of mass movements of forces that we associate with the Western way of war. Again, I'm not denying the violence. I am looking at the kind of organizational logic behind that violence. Perhaps the only country that would have the military capacity to really engage in this kind of struggle might be South Africa. But again, it is unlikely that it is going to engage in any of that with its neighbors. There have been attempts to create a West African, in a sense, police force. This has had mixed results when it's tried to control local violence. And it remains, again, more of a police force than an actual military organization, one that is oriented towards the destruction of some enemy. The situation, of course, looks quite different if we look at the Middle East and Central Asia. Here, it seems that the classic Western way of war remains, but with some limits. The preponderance of the Israeli military and the possession, the monopoly so far, of Israel of nuclear weapons makes the kind of even very short term major theater war that we saw in the 1950s, the 1940s, 1950s, 1970s, very, very unlikely. That is, because of the weakness of the surrounding states and the collapse of Syria, Israel, in a sense, does not have to fear this kind of conventional attack. In the 1980s, saw a tragic version of a major theater war between Iraq and Iran, sort of a replay of the worst parts of World War I. But again, given the changes in Iraq, the disappearance of Saddam Hussein, the possible breakup of Iraq that we will talk about, that kind of struggle is unlikely. We will get a little bit to the more recent events in Iraq, but rather than seeing the possible conflicts between a Shia Iraq and ISIS, or even the involvement of the Kurds or the penetration of Iran, I think we have to be cautious about thinking of this as a major theater war. Obviously, the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia continually prepare for this kind of struggle. The amount of military hardware and training that these countries possess is quite amazing, largely, in a sense, trying to prevent any kind of attack from Iran. Again, while there's going to be conflict in these countries, while we might see a great deal of tension between them, I don't think there are many who believe that a conventional warfare between, let's say, some kind of alliance of the southern Gulf, if you will, the Sunni-dominated Gulf, and the Shia Iran is likely, although we might see that. And certainly both sets of countries have created the kinds of capacities that may be possible to use in a major theater war. We also have some potential zones of conflict around the Caspian. You have relatively weak states. And again, here we might see conflict, we might see some kind of violence, but certainly not the high level of organization and resource use that we associate with the classic Western way of war. If we move farther east, let's first look at South Asia. Here again, we have an armed camp. We have a classic, almost Cold War, often getting quite hot, between the Indian military and the Pakistani military. We have confrontations in some of the highest mountains of the world. We have a great deal of violence going on. However, the mutual possession of nuclear weapons makes the kind of classic major theater war somewhat unlikely. This might be, the India-Pakistan dispute, might be the one case that really proves or disproves the idea that the destructive power of nuclear war is, in a sense, something of a peacemaker. That both countries would be very reluctant to enter into, certainly they're going to keep shooting at each other, there's going to be continued violence, there's going to be continued deaths, but a major declaration of war, a major kind of action might be controlled by the fear that it would escalate into nuclear war. According to various experts, if there is a place where some kind of use of nuclear weapons is likely, probably, unfortunately and sadly, this might be the area, but we will see. Then we move to China, and here's perhaps the closest we come to a 19th or 20th century balance of power, where you have a possible hegemon or a likely hegemon that has interest perhaps in expanding. There have been efforts by China to claim larger and larger parts of the South China Sea because of the petroleum resources. There are possible conflicts of China with all of its neighbors. There's ongoing tensions with Japan, ongoing tensions with Korea, certainly ongoing tensions with Vietnam. Let's not forget that there was a war between China and Vietnam in 1979. China is in a very particular situation in that it has massive need for resources. If we look, for example, at the flow of rivers in most of South Asia, we see that they largely come from this mountainous area here. Thus, for example, China's very, very strong interest in maintaining control over Tibet and this kind of area. China's need for resource could even, again, in the 19th and the 20th century form, see it trying to reach into Siberia and its water and its various minerals. But here, again, a sort of nuclear balance of death would likely prevent this kind of struggle. The most likely kind of confrontation here might be between China and the United States, representing some kind of, the United States representing the interests of some of these neighbors. This would have to be a localized war in a sense. China would not have the capacity, except with some nuclear weapons, to attack the United States. The United States would be very reluctant, certainly, to get into a massive struggle with China. What I think we might see here is moments of tension, of aircraft carriers, in a sense, now that China is developing its own aircraft carrier, of planes buzzing each other, of navies playing games with each other. But given the economic and commercial links between China and the United States, again, the likelihood of this outbreak of old-fashioned, if you will, organized violence is relatively unlikely.